The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. This hearing is being conducted virtually, so I want to remind members that they are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. When you are recognized to speak, if I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. To avoid inadvertent background noise, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participant microphones when they are not recognized to speak. We will be operating under the 5-minute rule. If there is a technology issue during a member's speaking time, I will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, but you will retain the balance of your time. The timer on the screen will turn yellow with 1 minute remaining and will turn red when a member's time has expired. We will follow the speaking order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and the ranking member, followed by members present at the time of the hearing is called to order, in order of seniority, and we will alternate by party. Next, we will go to members who were not present when the hearing was called to order until every member present has had a first round. Members can submit written information for any of our hearings or markups via an email address that has been provided to your staff. Now let's begin. I want to welcome everyone to this important hearing on the growing problem of targeted violence and terrorism, particularly domestic violent extremism. We will have 2 panels this morning. The witness for our first panel are John Cohen, the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats at the Department of Homeland Security, and John Piccarelli, the Director of the Department's Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. Thank you both for joining us this morning. The second panel will feature representatives from organizations that have been awarded grant funding from the department to develop and model strategies for preventing targeted violence and terrorism. January 6th was a wake-up call for many people, but we have seen evidence of a growing problem of targeted violence and domestic violent extremism over the last several years. Former Secretary Johnson was an early advocate of investing in this area, and we worked with him late in the FY16 funding cycle to establish a grant program focused on countering violent extremism. Unfortunately, the focus of the program took a wrong turn at the beginning of the last administration, focusing insufficiently on countering domestic extremism, with the result that no additional funding was appropriated for the grants between FY17 and FY19. I am glad that this effort seems to have righted itself in the last couple of years, resulting in an appropriation of $10 million in FY20 for TVTP grants and $20 million for FY21. Overall, our FY21 bill included more than $80 million for TVTP activities across the department, an increase of $61 million, including a total of $16.5 million for the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. This morning, we want to find out more about the department's role in countering violent extremism of every kind, what you are learning about the causes of radicalization that leads to violence, and how communities can help prevent it. Our hearing is particularly timely, given the release last week of a report by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence entitled Domestic Violent Extremism Poses Heightened Threat in 2021. Unfortunately, it is also highly pertinent in light of the murder of 8 people at Asian American businesses in Georgia last week and the targeted killing of 10 people at a grocery store in Colorado this week. I would like now to turn to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Ranking Member Fleischman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I really appreciate your holding this subcommittee hearing at this difficult time in our history and on this very sensitive and difficult subject matter. It is truly a somber and serious issue that is affecting many in our country, in our communities, and for some, even within our families. This issue hits home for me. For some of my new colleagues, you may not know, but on a beautiful day in June, a few years ago, my colleagues and I were shot at and nearly assassinated on a baseball field in Virginia by a lone shooter driven by hate. Almost 4 years later, I still feel blessed to have walked off that field that day, basically physically unharmed. I got a little bit bloodied in my hands and my knees running from the shooter and diving in the dugout, but thank God I was not shot. Others were, including some of our Capitol Police and members. But I'm saddened that at this time, the same type of extremism and hate is driving more people to commit acts of violence. Even more alarming is that violence is coming from our fellow Americans. Let me say this. It is wonderful to have ideas for passions or a cause. It moves people to lead or help others. We are in this hearing, obviously, felt a passion to run for office, to represent people in our districts, and to serve this great country. We don't always agree, we debate. However, it is a very different and dangerous situation when a passion for ideas and civil discourse in the face of disagreement instead turns into extremism and violence. I support the investments that this committee has made to try to turn that tide for the safety of all people. I thank all of the witnesses today, Assistant Secretary Cohen and Director Piccarelli with the Department of Homeland Security, and everyone on this second panel who run some of the organizations that have received DHH grants to work to diffuse the violence or the potential for violence. I am eager to hear how DHS and these nonprofits are working to identify ways to mitigate these threats. I look forward to your testimony. Again, Madam Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
I would now like to turn to the chair of the Full Appropriations Committee, Mr. Laurel.
Thank you very, very much, Chairwoman Roybal-Allard, and I thank you and Ranking Member Fleischman for holding this hearing this morning, and I want to say a thank you to our witnesses for testifying. Quote, enough is enough. Thoughts and prayers, not one more. Quote, never more. Does anyone else feel like the speaker from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, as he ponders, quote, weak and weary, at the tapping, constant rapping heard at his chamber's door? Like the specter of death, the raven comes again and again, recalling the memory of a loved one lost. And again, the raven repeats the unchanging, slightly irritating, almost infuriating refrain, quote, nevermore. It reminds me of the words we hear following each new incident of targeted violence in this country. Enough is enough. Thoughts and prayers, not one more, never more. Never more will the 10 families in Boulder, Colorado see their loved ones smile again. Never more will the 6 families in Atlanta, Georgia embrace their mothers, their sisters, their wives. Never more will children in our schools and shoppers in our stores and even members, the Congress and staff in our Capitol feel safe unless we stop the spread of violence and domestic terrorism. We must stop our ceaseless yapping. We must stop the constant tapping. We must stop the endless rapping at our chamber's door. There is no question why this keeps occurring. We already know the cause. Domestic violent terrorism and extremism has been growing in this country for years. Fueled by the rise of social media and the internet, extremist, violent, toxic ideologies have spread and contributed to a growing domestic threat from violent extremists, particularly white supremacists. To be clear, these attacks are certainly not all fueled by white supremacy, but racism and far-right extremism have led to 3 times as many targeted attacks on U.S. soil as Islamic terrorism. Since 2018, white supremacist groups have been responsible for more deaths than any other domestic extremist group. And while there are certainly many contributing factors that lead to these instances of violence and hate, often there is a common and variable refrain. Young men with guns, radicalized by extremist ideologies filled with hate. It was true in Atlanta, it was true in Charlottesville, it was true at the Walmart in El Paso. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been talking a lot this past year about how we can get back to normal. But as I have said before, going back to normal is not good enough. This new normal is not normal. Violence, especially domestic terrorism, is a disease that has been taking the lives of innocent Americans long before this COVID-19 pandemic. So what are we going to do about it? How are we going to stop the tapping? How are we going to stop the rapping? How are we going to stop the continual return of death? We are already developing the tools to help communities, states, and local governments understand what leads to radicalization. We already have the tools to develop strategies and prevent frameworks for off-ramping individuals from violent extremism. The Congress has a duty to ensure our Department of Homeland Security is armed with these important tools and equipped with the funding and the resources it needs to stop this never-ending violence. And we must also summon the will to act to stop the widespread availability of weapons of war on our streets. The background check bills, which passed the House last week, are a good start, but not nearly enough to keep our families and our communities safe. And we owe it to every person in this country who has felt the pain of targeted violence or domestic terrorism to ensure that no more lives are lost to gun violence. Never more. And with that, I thank the chairwoman and the ranking member, and I yield back.
Assistant Secretary Cohen and Director Piccarelli, we will submit the full text of your official statements for the hearing record. Assistant Secretary Cohen, please begin your oral summary, which I would ask that you keep to 5 minutes.
Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Fleischman, member of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you today. I appreciate that you invited us to attend this important and timely hearing. Based on the events of the last 8 days, the 2 tragic, horrible shootings in the Atlanta area and in Boulder, Colorado, the timing of this hearing could not be more present. Over the past 8 days, the nation has experienced 2 separate mass casualty attacks. I would like to say these events were unusual, or these events were uncommon, or they were anomalies. But sadly, for the reasons stated by both of you and Chairwoman DeLauro, I can't. These types of targeted attacks have become way too common in our country. And while I appear before you today as the Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats at the Department of Homeland Security, the perspectives I will share with you today come from not only my current responsibilities, but also the work I've been engaged in over the past 10 years, both at the department and also outside of the department, examining mass casualty attacks, acts of targeted violence, and domestic extremism in the United States and Europe. So while the motives behind the 2 attacks referenced earlier in the Atlanta area and in Boulder, Colorado, are still under investigation, and while the motives have yet to be clearly identified, we do know already that there are striking similarities between both of those incidents and incidents that have been experienced across the country in the past. And I will use my time to share a little bit of our perspective on the on the current threat environment and some things that the department has initiated since January 20th to address that threat. But we often hear from people after these types of incidents that they can't be prevented. They're difficult. I will tell you, as somebody who has spent over 35 years in law enforcement and Homeland Security, that is just simply not true. These types of attacks can be prevented. there are things that we can do to make them less frequent. There are actually examples around the country where targeted attacks directed at schools, houses of worship have been prevented. In some cases, they've been prevented by the actions of a joint terrorism task force or another law enforcement investigation and prosecution. But there are a growing number of cases that have been prevented, or incidents that have been prevented by the actions of organizations such as those who are going to be appearing before you later today. They've been these incidents have been prevented by the actions of mental health professionals, community groups, faith leaders. And it's those types of prevention activities that through the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, we're seeking to expand upon. So over the past several years, the United States has experienced a number of targeted attacks by angry, disaffected individuals. In some cases, these individuals have been motivated by extremist ideologies or ideologies of foreign terrorist organizations. In other cases, they have been motivated by some form of personal grievance. In every case, these individuals have spent an enormous amount of time online, viewing extremist violent materials, engaging with like-minded individuals, and ultimately communicating online their intent to commit some type of violent act. In many cases, these individuals are inspired by conspiracy theories or extremist narratives that are spread online by a variety of foreign adversaries or domestic thought leaders. These attacks have targeted a cross-section of our society. People and facilities have been targeted because of their faith, their race, their gender, or ethnicity. They have targeted government facilities, law enforcement, members of Congress, as Ranking Member Fleischman referred to. They've also targeted simply places where people gather. Addressing this threat is complicated. It requires a multidimensional approach. And the department has taken a number of steps to expand our ability, working with the rest of the administration, our state and local partners, and the private sector and non-government entities. We're conducting a 60-day review of our posture. We're expanding our intelligence and analysis. We issued a bulletin under the National Terrorism Advisory System. We have expanded and prioritized domestic violent extremism in our FEMA grants. And just today, we issued a notice of funding opportunity for prevention grants that'll be awarded by the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. So I look forward to answering your questions. And thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today.
Okay, thank you. Director Piccarelli, please begin your 5-minute statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Roybal-Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. And thank you for holding today's hearing about the Office for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, or OTVTP, and this incredibly important topic. My name is John Piccarelli, and I am the director of the office. I've served the office since December 2016 and have worked in the prevention space for over a decade. Prior to joining DHS, I established research and evaluation grant portfolios that focused on radicalization of violent extremism, trafficking in persons, and transnational organized crime at the Department of Justice. Much of that work focused on prevention. All forms of terrorism and targeted violence, as we've already heard, weaken the fabric of our society. They inject trauma, fear, mistrust, and despair into the body politic. OTVTP seeks a resilient America where communities are united and empowered to bring an end to the tragedies of targeted violence and terrorism. Building from your generous support in the last 2 budget cycles, OTVTP is poised to bring and scale prevention efforts nationally. But this will require continued congressional engagement and support. The office focuses on local prevention frameworks. Rooted in the public health approach to violence prevention, these frameworks address societal conditions promoting targeted violence and terrorism while offering help to individuals before they commit a crime or violence. Research shows time and again that these individuals often exhibit behavioral indicators that are best understood by those closest to the individual, such as peers, family, and friends. So OTVTP consists of 5 teams that support these local prevention frameworks. The regional prevention coordinators of our field operations team cultivate trusted partnerships among the many local stakeholders that are needed to build multidisciplinary teams that form the backbone of these local prevention frameworks. Our first and most developed local prevention effort is in Colorado, where our coordinator in Denver has worked alongside colleagues from federal agencies and numerous state and local partners to build frameworks that now blanket the state. Another team oversees the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant Program, which invests in local prevention frameworks, in specific programs that support these frameworks, and in innovative projects that craft future prevention approaches. Last year, we worked with our partners at the Federal Emergency Management Agency to award the full $10 million to 29 grantees in 15 states, and that included financial support for 10 new local prevention frameworks. This year, thanks to the support of this subcommittee, our office will double that investment in these programs to $20 million. And as Assistant Secretary Cohen, noted earlier, we just released the notice of funding opportunity for this year's competitive grant program just this morning. My office also has a team that educates society about prevention. This education team is developing a curriculum that supports the full knowledge requirements of our local partners. It is also updating our courses to better reflect the public health approach I described earlier, while also capturing the evolving threat landscape that we face today. The fourth team in our office engages national representatives of prevention stakeholders. We do this so that they understand, validate, support, and champion local prevention efforts. For example, this team enhances awareness of harmful online activity, increases digital literacy, and offers a platform for innovative approaches in the digital space by hosting digital forums on targeted violence and terrorism prevention. Another important effort we're working on is to ensure the public has easy access to prevention-related materials and resources. For example, the fifth team in my office is drafting comprehensive baseline capabilities that outline the recommended and necessary minimum functional requirements for effective local prevention frameworks. We will also launch a nationwide public outreach campaign designed to provide practical information on how to participate in local prevention efforts later this year. My office understands that prevention efforts have the potential to impinge on protected speech or on other civil rights and civil liberties. We are now establishing an ongoing community engagement process to further address this topic with the CRCL community. And we continue to work closely with the DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties to ensure all programs consider the potential impact on such rights and liberties prior to implementation. Our office has made significant progress towards bringing prevention to scale, yet our goal of ensuring that all communities have access to prevention frameworks will take more time, effort, and resources. We look forward to continuing this work with you and other members of Congress to ensure we properly resource and implement this critical effort. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Extremism, in particular, violent white supremacism, is one of the most prevalent and abhorrent of these anti-American ideologies. There is no moral ambiguity on this issue, end quote. The ODNI report released last week confirms that ethnically motivated violent extremists and militia violent extremists present the most lethal threat of mass casualty attacks against civilians and government entities, respectively. Can you please elaborate on what the intelligence is telling us about the domestic extremist threat? What is motivating it? And what leads someone to take that last step from alienation to violence?
Thank you for your question, Madam Chairwoman. As I stated earlier, what we have experienced in this country is a growing level of violence by lone offenders or small groups of people who are inspired and motivated to violence by extremist ideologies or a combination of ideologies or some type of personal grievance. Essentially, the way it has been described to me in the past by members of the intelligence and law enforcement community is we have angry, disaffected individuals in this country who are seeking an excuse to use violence as a way to express that anger. And they will spend time online consuming large amounts of extremist material about past violent acts. They will become susceptible to being influenced by disinformation and conspiracy theories. They ultimately will self-connect with an extremist ideological cause or formulate in their mind a personal grievance or a combination of both and use that as the justification for going out and committing mass murder. In that total population of those who have committed acts of violence motivated by extremist ideologies, over the past several years, the most significant number of those attackers have been motivated by white supremacist anti-government militia or a combination of both of those extremist ideologies. So from a lethal attack perspective, the overwhelming majority of people who have committed lethal attacks have been inspired by those extremist ideologies. What's driving this in large part is two factors. One, the angry, polarized nature of our society, coupled with the fact that social media and other online platforms provide the opportunity for these disaffected, angry people to consume and come in contact with a large amount of information that ultimately serves as the source of inspiration for their act of violence.
This question is both for Secretary Cohen and Director Picker-Alley. And Secretary, I think you touched on this a little bit. The ODNI report indicates that, quote, domestic violent extremist attackers often radicalize independently by consuming, as you've said, violent extremist material online and mobilizing without direction from a violent extremist organization, making detection and disruption difficult, end quote. So given the centrality of the internet for spreading extremist ideology, are you working with social media companies to reduce the amount of radicalizing content? And what do you think they can, the role that they can play in countering the extremist narrative?
Yeah, so I will answer real quickly and then turn it over to Director Picker-Alley. Yes, this is a major part of our efforts, Madam Chairwoman. We are engaging with the tech industry, with academia, with other non-government organizations who are doing an extensive amount of research into narratives, the toxicity of these narratives, how those narratives influence violence. And some of the analysis that we're looking to be able to do more effectively at the department is to work with those outside entities, understand the narratives that are emerging, whether they're being introduced into the ecosystem by a foreign intelligence service, an international terrorist organization, or a domestic extremist group, and then assess which of those narratives are most likely to result in violent activity, and then the potential targets of that violent activity, so we can work with the communities to take steps to mitigate that risk. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Director Picker-Alley, for additional.
Thank you. I'll be brief and echo what Assistant Secretary Cohen said. In my office, we are working on this issue with significant focus. And I'll give you 4 brief examples of the breadth by which we approach this issue. First, we're looking to use our innovative grant portfolio to focus on it. And then last year, we funded projects, one or two of which you'll hear later today, but another one at American University that's been in the public eye of late, focuses on inoculation theory, trying to get as early as possible to reach folks who may consume this online hate and inoculate them towards it. So that's one approach. Another approach was one I mentioned, and that is the digital forums for targeted violence and terrorism prevention. Our most recent digital forum was held earlier this month. We had over 350 participants for 4 days who focused on how the gaming industry and esports can work with local community partners to better understand how radicalization to violence could be occurring through those platforms, but also to empower local community partners to use those platforms in order to enhance digital literacy and to be more proactive about being safe online. We are also about to launch As I mentioned, new digital literacy campaign materials. And we also just earlier this year launched a program to fund a competitive approach among college-age students at 25 universities and colleges across the country to tap their innovative spirit and have them help us think about new ways we might be able to address this online space through this competition. So we will look forward to keeping you informed of all of these as we proceed forward. Thank you.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Assistant Secretary Cohen and Director Piccarelli, I want to thank you again for your testimony today and for your serious attention to this issue that's facing our country. I have a few questions. In your written statement, I note with interest that combating domestic violence extremism is a national priority area for fiscal year 2021 state Homeland Security grants and the urban area security grants. How are you working with states and localities to best identify practices or effective and competent groups to partner with in order to craft a successful grant application and, more importantly, implement a successful program with the grant funds? I'm going to ask you a follow-up, if I may. How many states already have established systems or organizational structures to address domestic violence extremism in their states or assist localities to address these issues? And I will wait for both of your responses.
Thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. On the first question, we are working closely, meaning my broader Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats and also Director Piccarelli's office are working closely with FEMA and therefore through FEMA with the state grant administrative agencies, law enforcement, the state and local fusion centers to help them better identify programs and resources that are potentially available to support those needs. One of the areas we're very interested in providing greater support for is training, technical assistance in the area of threat assessment investigations and threat management strategies. These are capabilities that have been used for decades by the Secret Service and by the Behavioral Analysis Unit of the FBI, where they combine mental health expertise with law enforcement expertise to evaluate the risk posed by an individual who comes to their attention. As we've learned from a number of these attacks, these potential attackers don't always fit into a neat definitional box when they first come to the attention of law enforcement. So understanding whether this person represents a risk of violence is critically important. So expanding those opportunities for state and local is a major part of our priority. I'll turn it over to Director Piccarelli to address the other parts of your question.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
So thank you for the questions. They're great ones. In terms of grants, I'll keep my answer brief. One of the concerns that we always have when it comes to grant programs is ensuring that the barriers to entry are as low as possible. So in that regard, we are working through a number of mechanisms. My regional prevention coordinators, my grants team, we're using webinars to provide assistance to applicants to ensure that we get as large and robust and rich of an application group as we possibly can. This is a competitive grant program that we run, so more competition is better. And so last year, I think we had close to about 100 applications. We're hoping to see a significant increase on that this year. 100 applications, given we had been paused for at least 3 years, was a great number to see last year, and it's a good foundation, and we hope to continue to drive that number up this year through all of our efforts. In terms of your other question, which is, again, another great question, I did mention through grants, we've funded programs in 15 states. We also, through one of those grants, are working up a better picture of what kinds of capabilities do state and local partners have for what Assistant Secretary Cohen mentioned. What are the existing resources that we can build off of and supplement through our regional prevention coordinators and through our grants? That's something that's underway. So it's certainly something that I think would be great for us to continue to get you that information to your staff as we proceed, so that you have a more comprehensive picture of just where are the capability gaps and how is my office addressing those in the future.
Thank you for your comprehensive answers, gentlemen. Very helpful. I'll be brief. My time is ticking down, so I'll just ask one question. In your testimony, you mentioned that you're working with science and technology offices on metrics and a method for evaluating the effectiveness of grants. When do you hope to roll out an evaluation?
Sir, I believe that question was for me. We are currently running those evaluations right now. We are finalizing and updating a more comprehensive plan for evaluations as we speak, but we have already started working with the Directorate of Science and Technology to start selecting grantees from last year's competition and will again this year to do thorough impact evaluations on those awards. We also will be rolling out more robust measures to assess the entirety of the grant program to ensure that we are doing the best job possible in order to get those grants out to the folks that need them, and that we're building the right programs. So again, we'll be continuing that throughout the year and in the years to come, because impact evaluations is something that is very, very important to me, and is exactly how we can come back to you in the future and tell you what's working and what's not and why. Thank you.
And Ranking Member, if I can just add very, very quickly, that this is such an important issue, because what our goal is to take the lessons learned from last year's grants, this year's grants, and then take that knowledge and feed it into the broader grant program so we can replicate those programs that work in communities across the country.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Okay. Ms. DeLauro.
Thank the chair. And I want to thank our witnesses, Secretary Cohen, Director Piccarello. Let me just, and first of all, I just want to and get more information and knowledge about the grant programs in terms of intervention and prevention, I think, which is very helpful. But let me just ask you, and on this first question, it's kind of, if you will, a yes or no. Do you agree that this country has a problem with, or danger, if you will, from private unauthorized militia groups? Yes or no?
Yes.
Director? I can't hear you, Director.
My apologies. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Now, it's also my understanding that under federal law, there is no criminal or civil statute that prohibits the existence of private militia groups. Should we have a law that prohibits unauthorized private militia groups? There is now no federal law, no criminal or civil statute with regard to unauthorized private militia groups. Can I get each of you to comment on that, please?
I will. I'll start, Madam Chairwoman. Your question actually hits at a core issue, because part of the challenge in addressing domestic violent extremism is being able to distinguish between behavior that may be constitutionally protected under free speech and assembly rights, and that behavior which is tied to violence, to illicit activity. And so simply joining a group may not be unconstitutional or illegal, but joining a group that has the intent to commit violent act is. And what we have to do is make sure that we have the information, the intelligence capabilities, the investigative abilities to be able to distinguish between an individual or group's actions that may be constitutionally protected speech, and when that transition to be illegal or violent behavior. And as it relates to militia groups, that's exactly the point.
Mm-hmm. And do you believe that, just further question here, and then I'll want to hear from the director. Do you believe we have the tools, the intel analysis, or what we need to be able to identify the nature of the group that proclaim they are patriots or whatever they are, and then they, and anyway, I'm just trying to get at that core issue. Do we have the capability to be able to discern with these groups?
This is exactly the question that I have been asked to answer within the context of the Department of Homeland Security by the Secretary. My sense is that we have a lot of the tools, but we need to be ready to use them differently.
Okay. I want to then, and what do you mean about using them differently?
So one example includes how we monitor and evaluate online content. We, across the federal government, multiple federal agencies operating under different authorities have the ability to monitor what occurs in the online space. However, it's not the same as collecting intelligence between two foreign terrorists who are communicating with each other on forums or encrypted platforms or through other communications device, because a lot of the speech or a lot of the activity that occurs on those online forums, even forums that are known to be locations where domestic violent extremists congregate, much of that speech is constitutionally protected free speech. So providing our analysts the training so they can distinguish between speech that is simply somebody expressing their anger or their disagreement with the government, or whether it is a threat-related activity is important.
Okay, thank you, because I want to get to Director Piccarelli, and my time is running out. So if we had, looking at the tools and the training and what we need, should we have a law that prohibits unauthorized private militia groups, in your learned opinion?
Thank you for the question.
Well, let me get, Director, let me get the Secretary to answer the question outright first, and then I'll move to you.
Any group that engages in illegal activity and violent activity should be a group that is in violation of the law. Depending on your question, I mean, based on your question specifically, it very much would depend on what the language of the law is.
Yes, got it. Okay. Director Piccarelli.
Sorry for stepping on the Assistant Secretary. I will just add that in the prevention space, ma'am, everything that the Assistant Secretary just said is true. What we are most concerned about are behavioral indicators that we can provide to family and friends of individuals so they understand when someone may be radicalizing to violence.
Okay. I'm sorry, because my time has expired and the chair is going to, call me out of order here. But again, given what you have said, what the Secretary has said about the training, the law, should we have a law carefully crafted, carefully written, dealing with what the nuances of that prohibit unauthorized private militia groups?
I believe the Assistant Secretary already answered that, so I'll defer to him in case he has any additional comments.
This is yes or no in terms of making laws, which is what our responsibility is in this body and in this subcommittee, to protect the people of this country. Mr. Secretary, do you want to venture a yay or nay answer on this?
Yeah, Madam Chairman, I'm not trying to be evasive. I think I operate in a very concrete world. I'm a law enforcement professional, and I certainly think that if there is interest on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, in establishing that type of law, we would work closely with you to do so.
Fine. You've answered my question, and I say that to you, Director, as well. I think it falls within the purview of the Congress, of our looking at this in a new and different way, with a new tool that deals with unauthorized private militias who are engaged not in free speech, but in violent activity, vis-a-vis whether it is the Congress of the United States in a January 6th insurrection, or whether it is what was going on in this country for the last number of years, and puts families in jeopardy and in fear of their lives. Madam Chair, I yield back. I apologize for going over the allotted time. Thank you.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Listen, first I want to thank Secretary Coleman and Director Piccarelli. And I'd like to address very quickly the issue that Chairwoman DeLauro just brought up about these unauthorized violent militias. In fact, gentlemen, I would ask both of you, we have laws against that. We have RICO statutes, racketeering, influence, corrupt organizations. We have gang statutes. Now, I want to say this to both of you as well before I make any other comments, and that is, I want to congratulate you on the great job you're doing, because people don't realize it's hard to talk about what doesn't occur. But when I see the efforts through 15 states, $10 million, over 100 people who have been identified as having, this bizarre behavior that could lead them into mass violence. That's a pretty good number. Now, I had the same situation in Jacksonville when I was sheriff there, running a very large organization. I knew how many incidents we prevented through our initiatives like iWatch, through SARS reports, the suspicious activity reports that were coming through from citizens. And what I wanted to ask was, are those initiatives like SARS, like iWatch, which drives those SARS reports, going to the fusion centers and the JTTFs, are you guys beefing that up? I mean, I saw where you're talking about adding $20 million to these initiatives next year. And I think this is the key. On prevention and intervention, it goes to intelligence. Intelligence is always the challenge. And it's usually not that police don't have enough information. They usually have so much information that the real intelligence gets lost in all of the mega data. And so are you guys working on tools to give you an analysis versus just data dumps? Because there's a big difference between data and intelligence. So can you comment on that, please?
Yes, Congressman, thank you for that question. A very important point, and I'm not surprised, being a former sheriff, that you would raise this issue. In addition to, in this current grant guidance for UASI and State Homeland Security grant, in addition to prioritizing domestic violent extremism, Secretary Mayorkas also prioritized intelligence and information sharing, specifically for the reasons that you said. We have spoken to fusion centers, police departments, major county sheriffs, small county sheriffs, and they all say the same thing that you do, is that if we are going to be more effective in preventing these acts of violence, we need to have more tools so we're better able to identify those individuals who are experiencing the warning signs, exhibiting the suspicious activities, whether they appear online or in the community. We need to make sure our officers and analysts are trained to recognize and place those behaviors into context. We need to have more tools at the local level. So once we identify to be someone who's high risk, we may not have enough to arrest that person, but we still need to address the risk that they pose. So whether it's mental health services or other programs. So this is a core part of the department's efforts.
And I will tell you very, very quickly too, that after the Parkland shooting, I had a piece of legislation. It was the Stop School Violence Act that we were able to get signed into law. That really is about collecting this information that you just mentioned. After almost every one of these shootings, including Parkland, After these shootings, people said, you know, I always thought something like this, but you know, there's always those telltale signs that they knew about. Now in Parkland, it went way beyond telltale signs. Law enforcement down there dropped the ball. Local enforcement to begin with. And it was a chain all the way up to the FBI. But the point is, and I think you just touched on it, once we identify these individuals, we have got to have laws that allow us to help these people until they're ready to go back to society. Because I tell you, it's just like sexual predators. You know, it's not what they do, it's who they are. You know, robbers rob banks. That's not who they are. It's who they are because they inculcate this stuff so much. So can you talk a little bit about how can we, number one, slow down this this indoctrination that's going on online, and I'll also throw out our jails and prisons.
So, Congressman, a great question again. A number of police departments and sheriff's offices around the country have put in place threat management units. They are working closely with their communities to make community members aware of sort of the warning signs that may be exhibited. You know, one of the things that I have found personally frustrating, being a former police officer, is the number of stories I've heard from members of the community who said, I picked up the phone and called my local police department. I expressed concerns about, you know, my son or my brother or my friend. And they said, well, if they haven't committed a crime, there's nothing we can do. There are things we can do. So we have a big responsibility to make sure not only the community is aware and the community has confidence and trust in the police agency or law enforcement agency to make that call, but that the law enforcement agency is working with the right disciplines to know what to do. As far as the indoctrination, another extraordinarily key point. And in fact, it's actually the tech industry that is beginning to do quite a bit of work and research in figuring out how individuals who are susceptible to being influenced by toxic narratives, things that can be done to prevent that. So a big part of this is social media literacy, having parents understand that their kids are spending way too much time online and they're consuming violent material. It's establishing programs in our schools, and it's working with the tech sector and others to make sure that they use their skills to reduce the potential of this indoctrination, as you call it.
Great answer. Thank you, Mr. Cohen, and I yield back.
Okay. Ms. Underwood.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for calling today's hearing. I know that the threat of violent extremism has received renewed attention in the wake of the January 6th insurrection. But those of us who have long been sounding the alarm about this problem are eager to finally see it be taken seriously. Domestic violent extremists, and particularly violent white supremacists, pose a deadly threat to our homeland. To save lives, federal law enforcement and their partners must seize on opportunities to intervene before the violence begins in ways that preserve civil rights and civil liberties. Mr. Piccarelli, can you briefly explain to the committee why the grant programs and other work supported by the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention are a good investment of federal resources and how they fit into the department's efforts to counter domestic terrorism in particular?
Thank you for the question. That's an excellent one. And I will hit a lot of points very quickly. So in 2019, the RAND Corporation published a study where they looked at this comprehensively, how to proceed with prevention. And their two key findings were that first, they saw great value in building local programs through financial assistance, through educational assistance, through technical assistance. The other was to urge the government to invest in local field staff to be there with communities to help them through the challenges as they stood up these programs. As you've heard already today, this is a very complex situation that is fraught with potential for overstepping boundaries of privacy or civil rights and civil liberties. Having staff there present with these programs to then harness this education and financial assistance was the key. So the prevention efforts like ours are really the first opportunity to dissuade someone from committing targeted violence and terrorism. And when fully functional, it reduces the number of individuals progressing to violence. It eases the burden on the protection efforts that have gone into hardening houses of worship or schools, or reduces the workload that is already there for counterterrorism and investigation resources. And in an era, as you've heard, where individuals are mixing personal grievances with the tropes of domestic terrorism, often seen online, our programs are usually the first and only chance these individuals have to hear about an alternative to using violence to find some significance in their lives. That is where we exist. We are the very first point of contact for these individuals. And if we're doing our jobs right, everything that follows us that we've talked about here today has less work to do, and we result in less violence.
Thank you. I agree that the TVTP grants are a good investment in the safety of our communities. And in our second panel, we're going to hear even more about the critically important work that some of these grant recipients are doing. But as I'm sure you're both aware, some communities are wary of engaging with DHS at all, particularly those who already receive a disproportionate amount of negative attention from law enforcement. Mr. Cohen, what civil liberties protections are currently in place as part of the department's counterterrorism work, and what additional steps is the new administration taking to strengthen those protections?
Thank you, Congresswoman. A very critically important question. I mean, after 35 years in law enforcement and Homeland Security, I know that we can't do our job to protect our communities if the communities don't trust us. And if I'm just going to be candid, I would have to say that at the same time we are experiencing this diverse and dynamic threat, there are a number of communities, particularly communities of color, that simply do not trust local governments, do not trust the federal government. So we have to change that. And the way we change that is by establishing lines of communication, by engaging, by listening to people and taking what they say seriously, by understanding that there are decades, sometimes decades of experiences that are influencing their attitudes toward us. During our transition period, we met with a variety of community groups, faith-based groups, and other community-based organizations. And since January 20th, I've already personally met with a broad representation of community, immigrant, and faith-based representatives.
Mr. Cohen?
Yes.
My time is expiring. I just want to emphasize that we want to encourage the administration to pursue new options. Those sound like existing outreach opportunities, which are important, but we know that this problem will not be solved by doing the same things we've always done. I'm particularly concerned about this issue because the same communities of color who have been historically targeted by DHS are now targeted by actual terrorists, and the department has repeatedly been sued for subjecting Muslims to unwarranted surveillance. And just last year, DHS agents participated in the inappropriately militaristic federal response to protests led by Black activists. And we've seen Secretary Mayorkas in a Washington Post op-ed say that domestic violent extremism poses the most lethal and persistent terrorist threat to our country today. And the FBI director reiterated that. And I just want to remind everybody that DHS has a mission to protect Americans from that threat, but it's been made more difficult by the department's past abuses of the public's trust. And with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
So Congresswoman or Madam Chairman, if I could just respond very quickly to the Congresswoman. Everything we do in my world at DHS, whether it's the OTVTP or anything we're doing from a counterterrorism perspective, we are working closely with our Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office, and we are working closely with our Office of Privacy. We take the concerns of the community seriously, and I will say on a personal level, I'm the brother of my sister's a civil rights lawyer. Her husband's a civil rights lawyer. They would not allow me to do anything different than to respect the issues that you've just raised. So this is a top concern for the Secretary. It's a top concern for me. And I can guarantee you that any operational actions we take are going to take the concerns you raised into mind.
Okay, Ms. Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate you holding this very important hearing today on an issue that I think we clearly can work together to improve here as a committee. My first question this morning is for you, Mr. Assistant Secretary, Mr. Cohen. Thank you for coming before us today. I want to point out that in your opening testimony, you really gave us hope for prevention of many of the things we've talked about through your office and the hardworking law enforcement officers around the country, putting their lives on the line every day. So thank you for coming before us today. I want to start off by asking you about prevention activities of our Border Patrol agents. And I want to reference today a recent Axios report, which I would like to enter into the record with your permission, Madam Chairwoman.
Certainly. So be it.
Thank you. Customs and Border Patrol and Protection, which falls under DHS, arrested 4 people on the terrorist watch list attempting to cross our southern border. In your expert opinion, would you agree that it is a threat for several of these who are on the FBI's terrorist screening database to come into our country that way?
So thank you for your question, Congresswoman. So I have to tell you, after September 11th, in my earlier days in the Department of Homeland Security, and when I worked in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence during the Bush administration, I assumed that we would see a large influx of terrorists coming in from south of the border and seek to enter the country through the southern border. And we developed over the course of years extensive measures to be able to track individuals who are coming from terrorist safe havens, who are coming into Latin and South America, and to be able to identify when they were trying to cross the border. What we found is it just wasn't happening as much as we thought it would. In fact, it was happening very rarely. So on the one hand, we haven't seen the development of that threat to the degree that we anticipated. And secondarily, we've put in place extensive security measures to be able to detect any potential terrorist who would enter that region and seek to enter the United States through the southern border.
Well, I would say, though, that for getting across the border is a threat, and those people were clearly on the watch list for a reason. So what would you say we should be doing then to address this emerging threat? Because all it takes is one, as you know.
Absolutely. And I would be happy to provide you additional details in a more secure setting. But what I can tell you is that the derogatory information associated with those 4 individuals may not have been as significant to cause a high degree of concern. People are on the watch list for a variety of reasons. Some of it is that they may have had contact with someone who's potentially a known or suspected terrorist. In other cases, it may be that they are actively involved. We use the watch list to provide a broad range of potential actions, ranging from simply tracking someone's travel to putting more scrutiny on them as they are traveling, to no flying those people. Simply being on the watch list does not mean the person is a terrorist.
Understood. Well, I think we definitely need to take all of it very, very seriously. As we are aware of whether it's homegrown or out of this country, it is still definitely a threat to our national security. My next question is for you, Mr. Piccarelli. According to your website, obviously, you support mandates beyond extreme terrorism to include targeted violence. I would ask that you might share some examples of targeted violence, which could be based on some of the ideology we've heard today, just so my constituents have a clear example of what you're targeting.
Thank you for the question. I'm having some technical difficulties, so I believe you asked for some examples of targeted violence. What I would point to as one excellent example is the shooting that we saw years ago in
I think we've lost connection with Mr. Piccadilly.
Okay. Well, we'll submit some questions for follow-up then, so we can make sure we're getting them back up, and other members have a chance to ask questions too. But I think we need to be very targeted. I wanted to ask about reconnecting with the communities. Procedures are happening, and I know we're having those technical difficulties. So I'll follow up with some additional questions, but we need to make sure we're targeting our resources to rural communities as well. And with that, Madam, I'll yield back.
Absolutely. And we'll get your questions, make sure that they get to him and he'll be able to answer them.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses today for some useful, very useful information about efforts that are underway and what might be in prospect. I want to explore, if we might, the connection between these white nationalist and other extremist groups and weaponry, both as organizations and at the individual level. I guess partly this would be a question of what kind of coordination you have with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and other relevant agencies in terms of what kind of weaponry these groups are assembling, what kind of checks, if any, they're subject to, what kind of enforcement efforts are indicated or new laws are indicated with respect to the arming of these groups and what they might do with those arms. And I think there's also a question at the individual level. I'll give you a quick example. We had a hate crime in my district 6 years ago where 3 Muslim university students were killed by a neighbor of theirs. And in retrospect, there were plenty of signs of trouble with that neighbor. He had an arsenal in his apartment, and he had been engaged in menacing behavior. On the face of it, it looks like a situation where a red flag law, for example, might well have prevented that tragedy. But of course, there was no red flag law and no attempt to prevent him from assembling that arsenal. So I ask you to explore. This is obviously an important connection. It's on our minds right now for obvious reasons. What is the nexus between violent extremism and weaponry, and what kind of mechanisms do we have to enforce present laws, and what kind of new laws might be indicated? And I am asking this at both the collective and the individual level.
Congressman, thank you for the question. It's a very relevant question. So part of the dynamics of the current threat is that these individuals, and I think it was the chairwoman who brought this up, these individuals who, once they have connected with an ideological cause, may go from anger to mobilization to violence in a relatively quick time period. For those individuals who follow that progression to violence, they will typically acquire a weapon that is easy to acquire. If they don't already own a gun or a knife or a car or a vehicle that they're going to use in the attack, they will go out and acquire a weapon that is easily accessible. And if they are not if they're not precluded from buying a firearm, they can walk into a gun store and essentially, as long as they don't have an adjudicated mental health case or a felony criminal record, they can purchase the gun. In the cases where we have groups of individuals who have adopted an extremist ideological belief, they tend to have more sophisticated weaponry. They have been meeting for a period of time. They may have military or law enforcement background, or at least they are wannabe military and law enforcement types. They do their research. We've seen them in possession of high-powered weapons, large capacity clips, some even obtaining silencers. So the question of what type of weaponry are they using varies into what part of the threat environment they fall into. Are they an individual who's upset, who connects and moves rapidly to violence? They may have a pistol or some other type of weapon of convenience. If they are an organized group that's been planning for a significant period of time, they may have more sophisticated weaponry.
Well, I guess my question, if I could interrupt since we have limited time, my question is about the adequacy, I guess, of present information that you have and also of present enforcement. Is anything happening to prevent the amassing of these arsenals by these groups, and if not by you, by other agencies?
So we work closely with the FBI, with ATF, with others. Part of the challenge is that unless those individuals fall within one of the specific categories under law that preclude them from being able to acquire a gun, it's very difficult to prevent them unless we have an articulable reason why they shouldn't be able to get a gun. As far as your point about the red flag law, I am a huge fan of red flag laws, not just because of my current position, but because of my background in law enforcement. I have actually seen those laws leveraged by local law enforcement and local communities on multiple occasions to prevent acts of violence. I know that there have been some concerns raised by some at a local level about red flag laws, but as a law enforcement professional, I think they are one of the most important tools we can use as part of a multidisciplinary threat management strategy.
Mr. Quigley.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. Thanks for your service. As you know, I serve on the Intel Committee as well. I'd like your perspective, maybe give us a report card. You referenced that there are multiple agencies that monitor activity, including online activity. What's your assessment of how we're doing sharing that information within agencies, across agencies that is, and with local governments?
I think it's an area of improvement. The Secretary has asked us to take a hard look at how the various elements of the department are engaged in assessing online activity. We have some organizations within the department that conduct that type of work under their law enforcement authorities, others that do it under their screening and vetting authorities, and then elements of the department like intelligence and analysis, which do it under their intelligence responsibilities. So we're looking at, are there more effective ways for us to leverage all of that lawfully gathered data to conduct analysis? And what are the challenge, how do we overcome the challenges about sharing that information with state and locals and others, particularly when we're talking about some information that may be constitutionally protected speech? We have to make sure that in that analysis, we are very, very careful about distinguish between constitutionally protected speech and threat-related activity in the online environment. And so that's one of the—
How do you distinguish? I mean, something can be constitutionally protected speech, but at the same time could be vital information, piecing things together to understand a threat.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that piecing things together, which I think we need to do a better job on. So just because someone posts something online doesn't necessarily give you the complete picture. You have to look at other indicators, other pieces of information that relate to that post in order to assess whether it's potentially threat-related activity.
No, and again, how it pieces with something else that some other agency or local government may have that makes something make more sense and constitutes an overall threat.
Absolutely, and the Secretary has given direction for us to look at three things. One, how can we do a better job sharing within DHS and using the information we gather at DHS to conduct analysis? Second, how do we connect with what's going on across the federal government? And then third, working with outside the federal government, state and locals. There's a lot of work going on in fusion centers across the country where they're looking at online activity, and there's a lot of work going on in the non-government sector as well. I've been directed to look at all of that and come up with a strategy very quickly on how we're going to do a better job in assessing that type of information.
If you could pass that on to the committee to share, I would certainly appreciate it. And can you, and finally, just in the 2 minutes I have left, I think, the report also talks about lone wolf, the lone offenders. You've touched on that through answering some of the other questions, but just a little bit deeper dive on how you're addressing that and the unique threat that it poses.
Yeah, so just quickly, what we have found is the majority of these attacks are individuals who don't necessarily have long-standing relationships with an ideological cause or an ideological group, but these are people who exhibit certain consistent behavioral characteristics, and they spend a lot of time online. And as their anger at society increases, they ultimately self-connect with some ideology, and they conduct an attack on behalf of that ideology. In some cases, it may be an individual who decides they're associated with ISIS. In another case, it may be somebody who's decided they are now a white supremacist or an anti-government militia, or they believe that the government's illegitimate, or that they are upset because they are self-proclaimed involuntary celibate, or sometimes it's a combination of all of those. But the point is that they spend time online, they consume lots of material, they consume material about past attacks, they ultimately decide what ideological or group of ideological causes they are going to use to justify their act of violence. The issue here, though, is that while these people may not engage in activities consistent with past terrorists, people who are associated with terrorist groups, they aren't under the radar. They exhibit behaviors that other people observe, whether it's in the community, their family, or local law enforcement, or even other people online. So the challenge here is being able to gather and assess all that information and identify those people who are high risk, even if they're not engaging in what I would call traditional terrorism-related activity. They're not in contact with a foreign terrorist organization or known or suspected terrorist. They're not traveling to training sites. They're not engaging, they're not engaging in terrorist type travel. They aren't, in receiving materials or supplies or resources from terrorist financiers or terrorist suppliers. They're different, but their behaviors can be detected and their violence can be mitigated.
Thank you. I yield back.
Before I go to Mr. Aguilar, I understand that Director Piccarelli his technical problems have been fixed. So I would like to give him a minute to answer Ms. Henson's question. Ms. Henson, do you want to repeat the question?
Absolutely. Thank you, Madam Chair. And basically my question, Mr. Piccarelli, was specific to, I heard you reference, having those conversations with community partners and sharing information. So I'm just wanting to know how you're looking at targeting specifically in rural areas where our law enforcement agencies may not have the major infrastructure in place as some of our major cities. In the 1st District in Iowa, for example, Cedar Rapids is a major police department, right? They're big, they can handle a lot of this versus some of my smaller communities like Belle Plaine might not be able to. So I just would be interested in your take on that.
Thank you, because that's an excellent question, and I apologize that the internet decided not to cooperate when you asked it earlier. So the approach we take is to call it a local prevention framework, but we base that on the type of infrastructures that are present. And so we have done a lot of work actually to look at how to expand local prevention frameworks so that they are as applicable to an urban neighborhood, to a suburban town, to a rural county, or whatever is the method of organization. And where I come to this is when you look at law enforcement, you have 19,000 state and local law enforcement agencies across the country. You have some with an incredibly small geographical footprint with a large law enforcement presence. And then you have counties that are incredibly large and they are a sheriff's office with 4 or 5 sworn officers covering that. We need our prevention programs to scale just to that infrastructure. So we are working through our regional prevention coordinators in rural areas to understand and map out how our behavioral health services provided, how our schools provided, and working within those infrastructures to have prevention overlay them. We also did a grant with the Nebraska Emergency Management Agency in 2016 to look at this very question, asking them how to take this idea and now let's look at it in different rural contexts. And then in last year's awards, we actually pushed that even further. So now we're looking at tribal authorities. And so we're looking at how does this work in Indian country, which is yet another challenge from our perspective in terms of a different jurisdiction, a different sense of sovereignty and so forth. So we are definitely trying to ensure that whatever we establish isn't tied to geography. It has to be scalable.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I have a Meskwaki tribe as well in my district, so I appreciate the reference to tribal as well. So look forward to following up with you and working with you on these issues. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah. Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Piccarelli, since my district was targeted, just like Mr. Price had mentioned, so many of our districts have gone through similar circumstances. Mine was an act of domestic terror in December of 2015, and I've been committed to looking at ways that we can continue to work with local governments to give them the tools necessary to prevent this type of tragedy. This year, I introduced the PREVENT Act, Preventing Radical Extremist Violent Endeavors Now and Tomorrow. that would require DHS to provide trainings to state and local governments to learn how to counter the threats of terrorism, violent extremism, and white nationalism. This type of work falls within the line of the mission of your office and DHS's strategic framework for countering terrorism and targeted violence. Director, how has the office, how has OTVT, their prevention office, worked with their field offices and adapted that outreach, kind of building off of the last answer that you were talking about, to ensure that we were including these radicalized domestic actors as well?
Thank you. It's a great question. We focus first and foremost on ensuring that all of our educational products that we push out through our regional prevention coordinators and other methods of technical assistance adopt accurate behavioral indicators that capture as much of the targeted violence and terrorism prevention space as possible. Many of these are A-specific. They will be applicable to all forms of targeted violence and terrorism, but some are very specific to incel violent extremism or violent white supremacy. And so we build that in as well. We then, of course, use a whole of society approach. We're trying to ensure that we bring all partners to the table, that we get this information to the entirety of the locality so that we can then work with and get access to behavioral threat analysis and management from anyone who wishes to access it.
Gentlemen, building off of Ms. Underwood's questions as well about civil liberties and how we ensure that folks receive the proper information and aren't excluded. But these are the same communities in the past that have hesitancy toward working with DHS. You talked about this a little bit, Mr. Cohen, and could you elaborate on the new strategies that we could employ to ensure that the civil rights were front and center of what we're doing?
Thanks, Congressman. While I realize that this may sound similar to what was done in the past, I think part of what I have learned is that there is never too much collaboration and partnership and communication with these groups. And it's not just simply holding meetings and us telling them what we're doing and how we need them to help us, but it's engaging with those groups on a regular basis, those communities and groups and organizations on a regular basis, and using their input, their observations, their insights into the development of programs, into the way we talk about programs, in the language that we use, and in the way that we roll out programs. Separate and aside from that, I can meet with groups all day long. But if they have an encounter with a CBP officer or an ICE agent or a TSA agent or somebody else that's negative, then that will potentially undermine any good words or any good interaction that I have. So in large part of the change in part of our ability to be able to more effectively work with communities, particularly those communities that have been, who feel that they have a negative view towards DHS or they feel like they've been targeted by DHS, is in part based on how the department is changing the way it deals with those communities. It's what all of us do. And that comes from the culture at the top. And the secretary has made it very clear that that no matter what we do, whether it's an interaction at an airport checkpoint or it's the way that ICE and CBP behave in the field and conduct operations, it will be done in a respectful way. It will be done in a way that recognizes the humanity and the moral issues associated with these activities, and it will be done in a way that absolutely is consistent with the Constitution and law.
Thanks, Assistant Secretary. Director?
I would just add that one of the concerns that I have had, and I have started working with our Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties on, in fact, we have a detail from their office with us right now to work on this and a number of other issues, is because of the distributed nature of what we are establishing. We are relying on state and local partners to implement prevention. I want to ensure that there's always a way that anyone who feels that there's an infringement on civil rights or civil liberties has a way to contact us or a neutral third party to ensure that that is identified and corrected as soon as possible. And we will continue to use that and other mechanisms to ensure that our actions meet our words when we say we put civil rights and civil liberties at the forefront of everything we do in the office. Thank you.
Mr. Rupesberger.
I want to thank the two gentlemen, Mr. Cohen, Mr. Piccarello. Is that the correct pronunciation? Whatever. With a name like Rupesberger, I try to get it right. Anyhow, first thing, over the last decade, a few decades, white supremacists and other far-right extremists have made almost 3 times as many targeted attacks on U.S. soil as Islamic terrorists. Since 2018, the white supremacist groups have been responsible for more deaths than any other domestic extremist groups. Now, I was recently on a call with the leadership in the Baltimore FBI office, field office, and talking about what happened on January the 6th. And during this discussion, they spoke at length about the storming of the Capitol, including what went wrong, how to prevent it from ever happening again. Now, one of the challenges that they highlighted was the increased tendency for bad actors to use the dark web to communicate with co-conspirators. Now, when I was a prosecutor investigating crime organizations, it was easier than it is now. We secured a warrant and got to work. Now, those who wish to harm can fly under the radar, completely invisible to law enforcement. Now, with encrypted messaging applications, virtual private networks, and anonymous browsers such as Tor are able to be downloaded within minutes. I fear that we will only see more communications being pushed to the underbelly of the internet. Now, my questions for either Mr. Cohen or Piccarelli is: federal law enforcement technologically and statutorily capable of tracking domestic terrorists on the dark web, or does the trail immediately go cold? Now, also, with the temporary closure of the social media website Parler, and by the way, are you familiar with these names that I'm giving to you?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. Which some have dubbed the right-wing Twitter, have you seen more malcontents and dissidents move underground to the dark web? And basically, that's my first question.
The short answer is yes. While there's a large level of activity that occurs on public-facing sites, and that's actually an element of the playbook that these extremist thought leaders and terrorist groups and foreign intelligence services use to incite violence by people, what we have found is that as more and more law enforcement activities have focused on scrutinizing that activity, these extremist groups who are engaging in operational planning are moving to encrypted sites in particular and using encrypted applications such as the ones you described. It is very difficult for law enforcement to monitor those conversations on those encrypted sites.
Well, then what are we going to do? What are we going to do about that? Because it seems that's where they're going now. And we're dealing in this new world of technology. And if we don't find a way, and we have to legally pursuant to our Constitution, our laws in the United States, what are your recommendations going to be to go forward?
So, Congressman, not to date myself, but I think you and I began having these conversations back in the 90s. I think that's the million-dollar question. I know that the Justice Department is developing a series of recommendations. We're working closely with them on how to best address this issue. But you identify a real problem, and it's something that is not only impeding our ability to deal with domestic extremism, but other areas of criminal activity. The use of these platforms, using these easily acquired encrypted applications, make the monitoring of communications very difficult. I mean, I used to be concerned when drug traffickers were using payphones. The environment today is so much more complicated because of the ease of access and use of these encrypted platforms. So we look forward to working with you and trying to figure out a solution to that.
And the one thing you need here is teamwork, federal, state, and local. I think if looking back in my days years ago in law enforcement, that the JTTF probably was the best team where you had federal, state, and local. You not only did you receive intelligence, collect intelligence, but you had intelligence analyzed. And if you don't have that moving forward, and this is I see my time is running out, but we also have to talk about how, from a constitutional way, that we can get more from NSA to help you all, because they have no jurisdiction in the United States. So that's something that we're going to have to investigate and look at. So thank you, and I yield back.
Okay. This concludes our first panel. Assistant Secretary Cohen and Director Piccarelli, thank you very much for your time this morning. You have provided us with some very valuable insights and important information, and we want to continue to work with you to better address and prevent radicalization that leads to violence. We will now take a short recess to make sure that the second panel is ready to begin. Thank you again, Secretary Cohen and Director Piccarelli.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you all.
The subcommittee will now come to order. We'll now go to the second hearing panel, which includes Richard Aborn, the President of the Citizens Crime Commission of New York City, Tyler Cody, Director and co-founder of Operation 250, and Sammy Rangel, Executive Director and co-founder of Life After Hate. We appreciate your joining us this morning to discuss how each of your organizations is using DHS grant funding to counter radicalization that leads to violence. We will submit the full text of your official statements for the hearing record. Mr. Aborn, please begin your oral summary, which I ask that you keep to 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for not only calling this hearing, but for all the members of the panel for attending. It's a very important topic, and we really appreciate your attention. My name is Richard Aborn. By way of background, I am a former violent crime and homicide prosecutor from the Manhattan DA's office, and I've also done an enormous amount of work on the illegal gun issue in the United States, including having had the privilege of leading Jim and Sarah Brady's gun control group, at the time called Handgun Control, now called the Brady Center, and led at the time during the legislative fights over the Brady bill, the ban on assault weapons, and the ban on large magazines. In that context, permit me a moment to offer my deepest condolences to the victims, of the families, of the survivors of the families, sorry, of Atlanta and Boulder. It's a terrible tragedy, and particularly want to point out the heroism of police officer Eric Talley. Eric Talley embodies the best of the American police officer who gives him and herself selflessly every day to protect us in our communities. In the Crime Commission, which I now run, we practice something called precision prevention. That is, we try to identify those who are most likely to commit acts of violence and try and intervene in those acts before they actually happen. Our mandate is to develop innovative ideas around the most vexatious forms of violence. So in that context, we work on gangs, high-risk gang members, illegal guns, illegal gun trafficking, kids and guns, and of course, domestic and international terrorism. The way we got involved in this program that I'm going to describe now was that we received a phone call from the head of the National Security Division in the Eastern District of New York, who asked a rather straightforward question. He conveyed that he had adequate tools to respond to serious acts of terror, both domestic and foreign. However, what he lacked were tools to help intervene with those cases that might not rise to the level of needing a terrorism charge, or if a terrorism charge was required, not requiring a lengthy jail sentence or any jail sentence at all, but he literally did not know what to do. So he was very worried about those cases not receiving attention. In response to that, we looked at the intervention we do around gang work. We intervene with gang members and looked to see whether or not we could adapt that work into the terrorism space. And it turned out that we could. We spent well over a year studying the behaviors associated with mobilization. We spent well over a year understanding those emotional drivers that could be moving somebody to engage in this sort of ideologically driven violence, and developed a program which we call DEEP, which is the subject of this grant, which is now a custom tailored program that tries to understand and identify those emotional drivers that may be moving somebody to mobilize towards ideologically driven violence. What we are not is a de-radicalization program. And by that, I mean, we believe that people in America are entitled to their beliefs. We may not agree with the beliefs, but we believe people are entitled to their beliefs. However, we do not believe that people are entitled to engage in violence based on those beliefs. And that's where we come in. We look at that pathway to mobilization and try and stop that mobilization. And we do that through a multi-tiered process. So the way the operation works is the prosecutors, we work with the Eastern District of New York, the Southern District of New York, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, as well as the FBI and NYPD Intel. They will refer matters to us. These matters can be either pre-arrest, post-arrest, they can be pre-conviction, post-conviction, can even be individuals who have done short amount of time in prison. They will be released to us, they come into our program, and we engage them with a therapist who has been trained in this specialized methodology, which we call DEEP. That methodology is applied in a therapeutic session for as long as 9 to 12 to 18 months if need be. Assuming that person successfully completes the therapeutic interventions, we then pass that person along to a role we call a transitional specialist. That transitional specialist helps the person understand and actualize the lessons that they have learned in the therapy and get back into their normal lives. We then have a specialized job training unit, which helps place high-risk individuals, and these can be high-risk individuals. We also do that in the gang space, into jobs. Now, we have just launched this. We're just getting off the ground. We're just taking in our first cases, but that is the plan that we intend to implement with the assistance of this grant, and we will be evaluating as we go along. The DEEP program, in my mind, and frankly, all of the work that's being done around this issue, very nicely incorporates both the issues of understanding of the intersection between mental health and potential criminal offending, which is a critical component to any sort of crime-fighting apparatus in the United States. We must focus on the mental health piece. And it also very nicely ties in a public health approach. So in government's very fond of saying we have a whole of government approach. This really is, as John Piccarelli said, a whole of society approach. And it is really a critical way to try and respond to this growing threat we face in the United States. There is no doubt that this will need sustained funding, and I'm very pleased to see that DHS just today has introduced another round of funding, and I hope Congress will continue to fund this very critical work. It is not easy work. It is not something that we have years and years and years of experience doing. We are all learning in some ways as we go along, but there is an enormous amount of skill being applied to this now, which is very, very good for the future. Because I think as we build out across the country a framework, to use DHS's term, that allows citizens to turn to various individuals who understand the mental health side of this issue, we will begin to build more and more resiliency across the country, which is obviously very important. Before I conclude, I do want to mention three people in particular. I want to mention Seth Ducharme, who was the U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District, who actually helped us get this program off the ground. It was very good of Seth, to understand the role of prevention in terrorism. That was a big step, and it was an important step, and I think it's going to pay off and pay off very handsomely. And I really have to mention John Piccarelli and his unit at DHS. Long before Congress began thinking about these grants, as far as I know, John and his group were there supporting us, helping us, making connections for us, acting as a sounding board. They simply could not have been of more support, and we are really indebted. And I'm frankly very indebted to Congress for putting up this money, because we could not operate without this support. Thank you.
Mr. Cody.
Chairwoman Roybal-Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify on the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention's grant program today. I'm Tyler Cody, co-founder and director of the nonprofit organization Operation 250, and I'm honored to appear before you. Operation 250 is a preventative educational organization headquartered in Massachusetts that works with students and educators with the ultimate goal of keeping youth safe from threatening materials and individuals while online. Our work is through a series of educational workshops and trainings with students ranging from the ages of 9 to 18 and with educators from elementary, middle, and high schools. The pillars of our programming are focused on using online safety, anti-hate and anti-extremism, and problem-solving education to impact the threat malevolent online materials and individuals can pose on youth. Starting in 2016, as part of the Department of Homeland Security and Adventure Partners peer-to-peer challenging extremism innovation program, myself and my colleagues developed Operation 250. Upon the completion of that program, which we finished third in the country, we formed a partnership with the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health to begin the process of evaluating our curriculum. Then, starting in 2019, the University of Massachusetts Lowell, a research team at Georgia State University, and research team at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Op 250 received funding from the National Institute of Justice to evaluate the Operation 250 student workshop model's efficacy. Such workshops are original research-based lessons designed and delivered by the Operation 250 team that combine 2 skills acquisition lessons with 1 skill application activity for the students to engage with. The goals of these workshops are for the students to acquire skills about recognizing unsafe online behaviors, the psychology of online decision-making, enhancing their understanding about hate and hostile outgroup attitudes online, and identifying risks and threats when they're on the online space. These skills are then applied by the students in an activity at identifying how these issues might impact their own community, their own school, and their own friend groups, and for them to develop potential solution ideas that they can all then participate in. Over the course of these evaluations, we have found that our student workshop programming has shown significant improvements in students' ability to identify online disinhibited behaviors and the effects of them, which is a key element of our online safety education. Toxic online disinhibition is the phenomenon of when an individual loosens up and feels more comfortable because they're online, causing them to be more willing to engage and participate in more hostile and toxic material on the online space. The ongoing evaluation also has shown an approaching significance in students' ability to correctly identify risks while online. Organizationally, we find measuring and fully understanding the impact of our educational programming has to be critical in our effort. In 2020, we were awarded the funding from the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention to replicate our student workshop, student lecture, and educator training programs. This funding offers us the opportunity to replicate this programming throughout Massachusetts and to extend into new school systems in New Hampshire. The funding will allow us to reach an estimated 930 students through our workshop, another 1,000 through our lecture series, in addition to being able to deliver teacher trainings to approximately 630 educators, school administrators, and school counselors as well. This funding will also allow us to grow our team by training more educational program trainers who will be able to deliver the variety of Operation 250's program offerings for the organizations to communities and schools. Since 2017, Op 250 has delivered programming to approximately 1,100 students and over 1,000 educators in Massachusetts through our workshops, lectures, and trainings. With the funds granted by the OTVTP, our organization has the opportunity of doubling our reach and ultimately expanding our impact to new communities and schools. With our focus of online safety, we're able to offer prevention education to communities. As a nonprofit in the space, this funding grants us the opportunity to work with and be flexible to communities and schools to ensure that our programming uniquely suits the audience it is working with and to be a preventative tool in ongoing efforts against terrorism and extremism, such as that of white supremacy online. This grant program offers organizations like Op 250 the opportunity of being a preventative solution. Prevention is about readiness, preparedness, and acting ahead before something happens. In striving to improve youth online safety and digital literacy skills and educators' confidence and understanding in teaching strategies aimed at improving youth online behavior, youth will be better equipped to critically think, analyze, and ultimately be protected from malevolent influences online. Thank you for affording me the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you. Mr. Rangel.
Chairwoman Roybal-Allard and Ranking Member Fleischman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss how the Department of Homeland Security is supporting our work disrupting the threat of white supremacist violent extremism. My name is Sammy Rangel, and I am a co-founder and the executive director of Life After Hate, the first nonprofit in the U.S. dedicated to helping men and women leave the violent far right. Our vision is a world that allows people to change and contribute to society without violence. We extend our condolences to Atlanta and Boulder. Life After Hate's story begins in 2011, when a group of formers, that's the term we use to describe former violent extremists, came together knowing two things. We had each gone through the complicated work of exiting violent extremism without peer or professional support, and we were committed to making sure that anyone wanting to exit would never have to do it alone. 4 years later, we launched Exit USA, the intervention program of Life After Hate. Last year, Exit USA managed more than 220 new cases, a sharp increase over the previous 2 years. We expect this trend to continue during the current grant program and beyond. Life After Hate is built on the belief that anyone taking steps towards accountability for their journey creates the possibility for redemption. I want to share a story of one of our colleagues, Thomas Engelman, an example of the potential strength of this program, as well as the obstacles formers face. Thomas overcame great odds to become the person he was. He spent much of his life engaged in violent white supremacy, and it nearly cost him his life at the hands of his group when he left. Sadly, Thomas passed away unexpectedly in August 2020. He lived the ideals of compassion, and he continues to inspire us. Thomas once said, "I really want to help people. The fact that I survived getting shot in the face is my motivation. I'm doing my best to dedicate the rest of my life to becoming the person I should have been all along." How the world viewed Thomas after he changed his life was not the same as how Thomas viewed himself. That's important because when formers attempt to make amends and reintegrate into society, they face many obstacles. In addition to violence, death, and incarceration, formers face many emotional obstacles to exiting, including shame, guilt, and a loss of identity. These are the problems our organization was founded to solve, easing the sense of loneliness and mending the disconnection from society. We have learned that individuals are more likely to disengage and begin the process of de-radicalization if there is a community waiting for them with support to help them through the process. We have identified 3 key areas of focus to achieve our mission and vision: Exit USA intervention and aftercare services, training and capacity building, and community engagement. These 3 areas are supported in part by the Department of Homeland Security 2-year grant. Our first focus is to expand Exit USA by hiring additional staff as well as enhancing existing roles. Second, we recognize that alone we cannot assist every person who wants to exit, every family concerned about a loved one, or every professional struggling to work with formers. In response, we developed an initiative with Exit USA to train and support local capacity and develop cultural competency for government and civic organizations. This grant will allow us to scale that training. Finally, community engagement is a critical component of Exit. Communities that are informed and engaged are more likely to support formers and, in turn, to promote disengagement and Exit as a viable option. This grant will give us the resources we need to optimize existing and introduce new outreach strategies to raise awareness and drive more at-risk individuals to Exit USA. Many of these men and women will at times experience a flicker of disillusionment when their expectations about the ideology clash with reality. Some white supremacists cycle out without confronting their involvement. Without guidance, where does that leave them? And where do they go from there? If we're not in the position to offer them the support they need to recover, we've missed a critical opportunity. Through the support of the Department of Homeland Security, we are better positioned to scale our mission and contribute to the whole of society approach to make our country healthy and safer. Thomas escaped white supremacy barely clinging to life. He could have stayed away, but he came back to help others find a way out. This is the ultimate expression of our ideals, and that is the work we continue today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hinkle. My first question is for Mr. Aborn. In your opening statement, you covered a lot of what I was going to ask with regards to the DEEP program. But by the time a participant is placed into the program, as I understand, they are already engaged with law enforcement and may have already been convicted of a crime. And although your testimony indicates that community outreach and referrals could be part of future program phases, how much more difficult is it to help a participant demobilize after they have already crossed into the line of criminal activity? And how long do you anticipate it will take to see results from the program's intervention with participants?
Thank you for that question. It is clearly more difficult once a person has crossed the line into committing actual criminal acts, but they are not by no means beyond redemption. We know from lots of experience in the traditional crime space that people who have committed even violent acts can be treated, can be helped to understand why they've done what they've done. They can be given the skills to not repeat that conduct and to re-enter a more, for lack of a better term, normal life. So we are very optimistic about this program. We have done an enormous amount of research. We have consulted with some of the top forensic psychologists and general psychologists in the country, as well as people throughout law enforcement to understand the behaviors. We believe we have a very good understanding now of what those behaviors are that drive this ideologically driven violence. And this program is designed to address precisely those. Our next phase, which we are now contemplating, trying to figure out how to do, is to reach out into the community. But I want to make sure that when we do that, we don't commit any of the past mistakes that occurred in this area. And I am also, because we do a lot of work in the police reform space, I am very mindful of some of the distrust that now exists between communities, particularly communities of color, and law enforcement. So I want to make sure that when we do this in a way that is received well by the community.
Okay. Mr. Rangel, Life After Hate's approach is focused on helping individuals who at some level may have already begun to be disillusioned with the path that they are on. Are there common factors, either in personality or experience, that help predict which people will be more open to exiting violent extremism and when they might be more open to it?
Thank you for the question. We do know that for each person that is coming to us, they have a unique set of circumstances and a unique set of outcomes. And each of them do require a different set of assistance skills or direction or focus. So it's difficult to say that there is a singular or even just a common thread. But we do see, across different populations that in some cases there are there are issues where they need needs met, and so we try to pair them with mental health professionals that are within our own services abilities to provide for them, or we refer them out. But it is difficult to say whether or not there is a straight line. It's not a straight line, and often we have to spend some time trying to understand all the different variables that each of those unique individuals bring with them.
Okay, well, you mentioned that that there's a degree of correlation between violent extremism and past trauma, mental health problems, and addiction. For those who don't have those factors, either in the past or present, what seems to drive people to extremist violence in those cases?
One of the things that has really stood out to us since we've started doing this work is that it doesn't always start with the ideology. I think that is often what surprises us most. A lot of times there are real or perceived grievances. There are real or perceived fears. And I think there are groups that are out there who are ready to exploit those vulnerabilities and through a number of ways. But one of those ways is making a message that seems relatable to them, and then drawing those individuals further in and eventually leading towards a path of adopting those types of violent extremist beliefs.
Mr. Cody, Operation 250 approaches the problem of violent extremism from a different vantage point before it has a chance to take hold. What factors in your experience make youth particularly vulnerable to extremist influence, particularly online?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman. So what we see and what we focus on in our work is predominantly focused on kind of those online behavior and online decision-making in youth. So in terms of vulnerabilities, as I understand your question of what may happen or what youth may come across, and what we're seeing is just general exposure to hate messages online can come at great risk. It could be something as though youth are it will reinforce discriminatory views that individuals may already have. And it also, one example that we've used in classrooms is, visiting a hate website. That type of behavior is correlated with or connected to potentially serious violent behavior as well. So we really try and focus on some of those online decision making, those online decisions that youth are making, recognizing when it is that maybe they are more willing to take a risk online than they would be offline, and recognizing when that happens and then how to stray clear of making those types of decisions.
Okay. Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to all of the witnesses. Thank you very much for addressing this situation that needs our attention, I think, in all of our communities at all levels of government, and very, very good hearing. I want to say that your written testimonies have been very compelling, and I thank you all for your hard work and commitment. Mr. Cody, you state in your testimony that 57% of students come across online hate messages in the past 2 months. This is a frightening statistic. What can parents do to protect their kids from being exposed to hate online, especially since they're spending more and more time online until the schools go back?
That's a phenomenal question, and thank you for asking it. It's a one thing in some of the research that we've been included in with some of the research partners that I had mentioned in my testimony is we're seeing that one big correlation is the time that youth are spending online increases their likelihood of coming across something online. Of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, youth are online at a rate higher than we've probably ever seen before, and it was already quite high before the COVID-19 pandemic as well. For parents, I know that what we've seen in some research is that the more that parents are involved in their youth online behavior, trying to be some sort of ally and trying to understand what it is that they're looking at online, trying to be as much of a help in terms of if they have any questions to be able to come to them, to be that, because that can really make a difference in terms of youth becoming susceptible to hate messages online. The hate messages may be coming across on just normal social media platforms or places where a lot of the young individuals may be spending time online. So it is becoming more and more challenging to keep them safe from becoming exposed to such content. But for parents, the more that they can attempt to be involved to try and be as much of a help to their youth and having conversations with them, we're seeing that that can definitely play a helpful role.
Thank you, and please continue to get this message out. Thank you so much, sir. My next question is for the panel in the time remaining, and time is waning, but what have you all been able to accomplish with the DHS grant funds that you were not able to do before? And how has your program become more effective or reached more people? And let me address that to the entire panel, please.
Well, I'm certainly happy to start, Congressman. Thank you. We frankly would not be able to operate without this funding. It's very, very hard for a not-for-profit to raise money to do this kind of work with the criminal justice system, and without support from the government, frankly now and probably going forward, we would not be able to do it. We've launched the program essentially 3 weeks ago now. We already have 3 participants in. I've received just another email while this hearing has been going on. So I expect that number to grow. We now have evaluation methods in place, and as we build a greater body of number of cases, we'll be able to give you some real feedback on how well this is working.
Thank you, sir. Next.
I'm happy to take it next. As I mentioned in my testimony, we're going to be, with the DHS funding, we're going to be able to nearly double our reach in terms of the individuals that will be able to, over double our reach in terms of the individuals that will be able to run online programming with. So it certainly helps with our online safety programming with. So it certainly helps with our scalability and being able to fund our time and effort and planning and prep and everything that goes involved with that to be able to deliver that programming to schools.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Rangel, do you want to take a shot at it?
Yes, thank you. I think one of the things we do know is that we anticipate, like, our online campaigns developed with Moonshot will lead to additional cases coming to us, which is why we've increased staffing in the grant year to assure appropriate caseload coverage so that we have the right capacity there to respond. We are also looking forward to developing counter-narrative video campaigns. I think we're going to do at least 5 under this grant to help direct new at-risk individuals and concerned family and friends to Exit USA. And then in part, the support, is part of what we're trying to do is extend our referrals through avenues like through our toll-free telephone number and the help form that we've located on our website to direct people towards us. So those are just some of the things that we might be able to do, that we will be doing under this grant.
Thank you, sir. And gentlemen, thanks again for your very important testimonies. Madam Chair, I will yield back.
Okay, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing their expertise with us. I'm particularly pleased that my colleagues had the opportunity to hear from Mr. Sammy Rangel about the work he's doing with Life After Hate, a leading national organization based in the great state of Illinois. It's so good to see you again, and I hope the next time it could be in person. Mr. Rangel, your organization has brought healing and peace to many families in Illinois and across the country. How will you use the federal resources that you're receiving through the TVTB grant program to scale up your work so you can reach even more people? And if you can quantify it, I know that you just responded to Mr. Fleischman similarly, but with the quantification, that'd be helpful.
Thank you, and it's good to see you again too. Well, the grant helps us in 3 ways. First, we're able to hire additional staff. We're building the capacity to do that. I mean, immediately upon receiving the grant, we started to develop that capacity, and so that we could adequately staff for what we know is an increase in the number of people that we see coming to us. And those numbers have continued to increase over the years, as I mentioned in my opening statement. Second, we're going to expand individual and community outreach to reach more at-risk individuals. We have to get the message out. There are people who are unaware that services like this exist. And as I heard one of our panelists answering a question earlier, before 2017, families didn't know we were a resource. Today, they make up half of our caseload. They're reaching out to us. And finally, we're going to train co-responder and local prevention networks to help us scale our work beyond. One of the things I recognized right away when coming on as the executive director is that while we wanted to make referrals, not many of the professionals that we could refer to knew anything about this space. And so scaling that work, scaling our education and what successes we're having with our approach becomes critical to this point.
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that you're working to expand your reach at this important time. The FBI identified violent white supremacy in particular as a leading threat. And I've heard from my own constituents, they're concerned about the rise of so-called militias and other extremist groups in our communities. Mr. Rangel, do you have the resources you need to meet this high level of demand for the type of services you provide? And if not, what additional resources would be helpful?
The short answer is no, we aren't fully resourced. Intervention is resource intensive. And it's so intensive with the person-to-person component, and also knowing that these services, as we've heard from other panels, can take months and years. And because we're serving at a national level, we have to be able to provide those services wherever those people are at. I think in addition to hiring more social workers and mental health practitioners, which I will make a note that there aren't very many of us in this space just yet.
Right.
I'm often alone in rooms where we're having these same discussions. We also need to invest in activities that fall outside the current scope of the grant, including research that informs our work. Outside the grant, we're working on developing a risk assessment tool for this population because there currently isn't one that has been validated in the U.S. context. Those are just a couple of the things I would say to that answer.
Thank you. And Mr. Rangel, Life After Hate has established a partnership with Facebook to redirect users who search for extremist content towards information that can help them disengage from violent groups and ideologies. What remains to be done to intervene in online radicalization, and how would additional federal resources help you to advance your work in this area?
I think one of the primary points I'd like to make here is that content moderation alone does not work. The power of social media in particular is to connect people who need help with resources that they need. Radicalization to violence may occur in part online, but the violence is real. We know this. We're here to help with that off-ramping part of the process. So part of that process then becomes costly to scale. We need resources and programs to support those disengaging from violent extremism, and also creating meaningful, relevant content that speaks to their specific needs. We're also working with Moonshot CVE through this grant. We'll be able to use their redirect model to reach at-risk individuals. One of Moonshot's co-founders, Vidya Ramalangam, is often talking about leveraging the same ad technology that big brands use to sell people to reach these groups online. And we have a similar challenge creating persuasive content to sell people on the idea that white supremacist violent extremism does not support their well-being or meet their personal needs. That content is both the message that gets them to Exit USA, but also it's the program itself.
Well, I certainly am so grateful for your leadership in this space and your dedication to helping folks, recover and re-engage in our community in healthy, peaceful ways. And I certainly look forward to continuing to work with you in the days to come. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you.
Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank the panel. You all are involved in what I think are the most important segments of what I call the pie for fighting crime and protecting communities, and that's prevention, intervention, and then enforcement comes third. And you all are out there doing the yeoman's work on prevention and intervention. And I want to ask Tyler about Operation 250. In 2018, as I mentioned to the former panel, we passed the Stop School Violence Act of 2018, and there is grant money available there to help teach students how to recognize not the focus of online threats and dangers, but the dangers of the student that might be sitting in the classroom with them. And actually, it also provides dollars for schools, mental health providers, and law enforcement to come together to create a network so that when these students see this kind of behavior, they actually have somewhere to report it and something gets done about it. So my question, Mr. Tyler, is, number one, did you know about the Stop School Violence Act, and have you accessed any of the dollars that are available there? Because it seems like it would plug right into your program.
Thank you for your question, Congressman. Yes, so actually, this is very timely as well. Recently, over the last, forgive me, I forget the exact timeline, but recently, over the last handful of months, we have received funding as a subaward, as a small part of a larger grant to a school system up in Massachusetts that they receive funding through the Stop School Violence program. And we will be running teacher trainings to kind of help educators. So what we're seeing in some of the research, and the research that isn't connected to us, but wider research, is that educators are not prepared to talk about online safety in the classroom. Or if they're not prepared, they're just not comfortable talking about it in the classroom. So what we're aiming to do with that project is to work with the health teachers of that school district to run training programs on, these are some of the strategies that we have seen in research that work with online safety education. These are a lot of the topics that we as an organization focus on, and that we've seen impacts in student behavior. And then these are some of the strategies that, importantly, have shown not to work in terms of actually educating about online safety. So that is something, Stop School Violence funding is something that we are aware of, and it's something that we're actually going to be participating on projects over the next few years.
Good, great to hear that. Listen, Sammy, you're at an entirely different place in this chain, this progression of people being indoctrinated, moving into extreme violent, domestic violence entities, and then coming out. What I'd like to ask you, Sammy, in the Life After Hate work, in the work that you do with people that leave these communities of violence, but based on your work, you mentioned earlier that it's not linear, this radicalization. And I think it's important. You mentioned how to do those risk assessments, and then sometimes you're the only person in the room. I will tell you, DOJ has some great risk assessment tools that were developed, by I think the Domestic Violence Intervention Program way back. But there are some great risk assessment tools there that you could look at. But my question is for you, what form do you see most people being radicalized in? I know it's not linear, but what seems to be the most dangerous form for them to be radicalized?
That's a question that makes me try to reflect on what it is that we're seeing. I think what your question makes me think of is the state that they're in when they come to us, and the state that seems to be leading to this idea that they need to maybe reflect and reconsider their choices is that it's when they hit a point of disillusionment where what they thought they were getting into, what they thought they were following or subscribing to, at some point doesn't match up with the reality of the situation they now find themselves in. After these large events, they're often questioning themselves as to whether or not that's what they really signed up for. And I think we even saw in more recent times, people questioning how did they end up in the predicament that they're now in, because that's not who they originally saw themselves as. And I think that
importantly, I guess, how did they get out of it? And Madam Speaker, I see my time has run out, but Sammy, thank you again for everything you all are doing. God bless you.
Thank you, sir.
Yield back.
I have several questions. We're almost out of time, but I would like to try and get some of these in. Mr. Rangel, I understand that the department is increasing the number of cases that it takes, that you take to expand your outreach. How much demand is there for what you are actually doing at this time?
Well, since our profile increased in 2017, our numbers have annually grown exponentially. We continue to meet new heights. I think within the last couple of years, we've actually surpassed what we did in all the years prior to those couple of years. And as I mentioned before, after 2017 events, families became aware of our program, and those numbers went from 0 to half of our caseload, where they're looking for assistance and guidance on what to do about the person that they're concerned with, that they're close to, or loved ones. So it is exponential, and we do, as I mentioned earlier, we do predict that those numbers will continue to increase monthly and yearly.
Okay. You talked about the importance of a sense of community. What is it about community that can make the difference between a path of violence and one of reconciliation? And also, you also talked about, and I was struck by the fact that you talked about compassion and empathy in helping people exit from violent extremism. Given all the public anger toward hate groups and extremists, what challenges do you have convincing the public that yours is the right approach?
I think as long as we also include accountability with compassion and empathy, it can help the community understand what we're trying to do. The sense of community, I believe, is innate to all human beings. We all want to belong. But what has happened is that oftentimes we have to consider what we belong to and what those groups that we belong to profess or want. And oftentimes, I think through our work, right, we're using motivational interviewing and trauma-informed care as the basis of our theory around what is effective. And those theories are really rooted in understanding that the person in front of us is not broken beyond repair, is not incorrigible or disposable. And although they might need an enormous amount of help, they are worthy of that enormous amount of help. But it also supports this idea that when it comes to public safety, we're all better served if we have alternatives other than condemnation for someone who has committed violent acts. I think our founders are prime examples of that, including myself, where that redemption is possible. But it can be made more possible when the community is there to receive them when working through their issues and their concerns with support.
Okay. I see that Mr. Rutherford, Mr. Ruppersberger has returned. Mr. Rutherford, you had another question. I can go to you before I go to Mr. Ruppersberger.
Okay, Madam Chair, thank you. I'll follow up on one of the things that we discussed during the last panel was a report that was outlining some of the violent extremist groups, anti-government, anti-authority violent extremism, racially, ethnically motivated violent extremism, even animal rights and environmental rights, violent extremism, abortion-related extremism. Sammy, during your time in trying to get help individuals who are extricating themselves from these violent extremist groups. Is there one of these that seems more dangerous to you now than the others?
Well, our co-founders are particularly tuned in based on their own personal experiences to violent white supremacy extremism, sir. And I think a lot of the partners on this call would support the fact that most of the data points towards perhaps the single most threat that we all face is coming from these violent white supremacist extremist groups.
Yeah.
And so that's where we choose to try to leverage our experiences and our methods to make the biggest impact for our country.
So to follow up on that, Sammy, so do you see this population then as somehow being, when you look at the fact that it's not linear, as you mentioned earlier, but it's a combination of things that occur to them, sexual violence, family violence, those kind of things. Are you seeing more of that in these white supremacists, the environments that they're coming out of?
Thank you for that. I do think that is certainly a part of what we see, but we also see people who have very real or perceived grievances and or fears. And to be honest, while listening to some of the grievances or fears that these men and women share with us, some of them appear to have valid basis. And so it's not all as if they have no actual grievance or actual fear to be concerned about. What we do try to focus and redirect our attentions to is how do we address that through pro-social methods? How do we take into account that there are other ways, peaceful ways to address those issues without having to condemn a group or use violence?
And so, Sammy, let me ask you this. Is that kind of an indictment then of a system where someone is, for example, the anti-government folks, the white supremacists who are against government, the sovereign citizens, that sort of thing? Do you find a lot of these folks are people who have a grievance that has not been properly addressed after they raised it, and then they kind of hit this dead end in the system, and then they decide to go outside the system? Is that a pretty common occurrence?
I would say that I relate to what you're asking there in the sense that in the days before my change, I felt violence was the only voice I had. And I think that is oftentimes the end result of feeling you're not being heard, that you're perhaps being dismissed or discounted or invalidated or not taken seriously. And of course, there are many other factors, but I do suspect that, and our experience in listening shows us that many times the one thing that we're doing that is working, if I may start over, is listening, which is an uncommon occurrence today, especially to these populations. And so I do believe that is the basis for a lot of the success that we're having, is that we find that listening is a part of the validation that they've been screaming for, and a part of the process towards developing a meaningful relationship that will allow us to engage with them in a meaningful way.
Thank you, and I appreciate that answer. And I'll tell you that is why I think, coming from the law enforcement community particularly, which often creates some of these grievances, I think it's so important that individuals have a way to address those grievances with those agencies where it's occurred. And that was one of my main concerns when I was a sheriff, was making sure that people knew they were being treated fairly and that they had that voice. So thank you for all you're doing. And Madam Chair, I see my time's run out. I yield back.
Mr. Rupesberger?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Executive Director Rangel, I have to admit that before this hearing, I was unfamiliar with your organization. However, after reading about your programs, I'm already a huge supporter. Your work is quite similar to groups in my district, or my state, like RACA or OCA, Safe Streets in Baltimore, and the Violence Intervention Program at the University of Maryland Shock Trauma, by the way, which is rated one of the top trauma systems in the world. I believe mental health, counseling, and support groups go a long way, especially if it's being led by those who were once victims of trauma and indoctrination themselves. In fact, I trust your strategy so much that I introduced a bipartisan bill with Representative Adam Kinzinger to establish grant funding to hospital-based violence intervention programs. Now, these operations offer a wraparound services to victims of violent crime while they are recuperating on hospital beds, effectively making them a captive audience. Now, patients are offered counseling and support that could include substance abuse treatment, job training to help really find them jobs, and finally, affordable housing, which really would, if they can get to that level, would take them out of the environment where they came from. Now, at Shock Trauma Program, that program I just talked about, the participants have shown an 83% decrease in rehospitalization due to intentional violent injury, and a 75% reduction in criminal activity, and 82% increase in employment. And those are pretty good numbers. Now, while the demographical groups might be different, the experiences are quite similar. Most individuals are a product of their environment. And my question for you is something that I want to take back to the groups I just mentioned. How do you make the initial connection and build trust with individuals who have been radicalized? And then also, to what extent is socioeconomic conditions a factor in who gets wrapped up in hateful and violent groups?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I want to make sure I understand your first part of your question. Could you please repeat
sure.
that?
I want to take back to these groups, okay, that I mentioned in my area, my state. How do you make the initial connection and build trust with individuals who have been radicalized?
Sure. Part of the experience that I'm leveraging here at Life After Hate comes from a planning and implementation grant I participated with in reentry, working with some of the groups like that you mentioned. And what we learned there is that the approach that any organization or agency uses is often a bigger predictor of outcomes than the actual ability of the person to change. So basically, and that's one of the reasons we're using MI, because so while MI works with clients, it also informs those of us at, leading the charge into helping how to approach these spaces. So that approach is what is effectively establishing the relationship that you're asking about. So it comes from respecting the person regardless of what they've done, and demonstrating that respect through your policies, through your administration, through your partnerships, through the advocacy work that you're doing. They need to see that not only are you addressing risks and needs that they have, but also barriers that exist in the community. That is a major part of our model right now. Aside from that, once they're talking with us, as I mentioned earlier, that the listening, the onset of listening for them is often enough to kind of shake through their defenses, because they're prepared for a fight. What they're not necessarily used to getting is acceptance, and that acceptance of them as a human being who is still worthy of assistance, not necessarily anything that they've done or said. And I think when you can preserve that part of the interaction with an individual, then they start to trust you enough to open up and start sharing the parts that you actually need to work on with them.
And trust is so important. The other thing is that to what extent is socioeconomic conditions a factor in who gets wrapped up in hateful and violent groups?
I do think it's a factor that we should take in, but even as of late, and maybe even perhaps since 2017, we recognize that not all of these men and women fit that older model of broken homes and separated families or poverty or lack of education, because quite a few of these men and women or coming from wealthy families that were intact, who have college degrees or who have professional careers. And so I think there are many factors that we need to be taken in, and some that maybe we haven't historically considered before.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. Needed, necessary.
Thank you.
Go back.
Okay, I have a question. In the interest of time, I have a question for Mr. Cody, and I'm going to put them all together. Is there a particular age at which young people are particularly vulnerable to extremist influence? And is there a case for developing appropriate programming for kids younger than 9? And what kind of reception are you getting from school administrators and educators?
Thank you, Chairwoman, for the question. We so in our work, we haven't come across, just in the work that we've done specifically, we haven't come across anything that would suggest a certain age is the most susceptible. Now, of course, as I had mentioned in a previous question, the more time individuals are spending online, the more likely that they are to become exposed to potentially harmful material. So with that understanding, the idea, the older you get, the more attention that you may want to start paying to. In terms of the types of lessons that we run, we talk about the time that youth are spending online, the relationship with their technology and such. Now, in terms of developing workshops and some sort of toolkit for younger than 9, we ran it's the only time we've ever run programming with youth younger than the age of 9. It was a part of a Girl Scouts cybersecurity day with students as young as, I believe, 7 and 8. And we ran programming just specifically on online disinhibition. And the way that we did it was we gave all of the Girl Scouts 3D glasses, and we said, well, if you have these 3D glasses, it's as if you're invisible, pardon me. And if you're invisible, what are you more likely to do? And so you had all the students coming out, or all the girls coming out with things of, well, I'm going to sneak downstairs when I'm not supposed to. I'm going to be doing things, taking a few more risks. And then we lent that back to when we go online, and it may not be something that they're all doing right now, but it may be something that they do in the future, they may end up feeling more comfortable to do something online than they would offline, just like they would if they were invisible in the real world. So trying to work with them to identify when they have that feeling. So that's our experience with working with youth younger age. Now, youth are coming into contact with technology quicker than they were really at any other point in human history, I would say. So I definitely think that there needs to be age appropriate programs and workshops and toolkits, anything of sort, to really sort of help youth be introduced in technology in a very healthy way. Something that we would love to do moving forward. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to be able to do everything, but it is something that definitely would be helpful for youth of a younger age, even younger than 9.
Okay, and what kind of reception are you getting from school administrators and educators?
Oh, right. So apologies for missing that question. So the reception that we've been receiving, of course, during COVID-19, it has been a challenge. School districts are trying to maneuver on the virtual or hybrid platforms and classroom management. So that has been a challenge in terms of actually being able to work with as many schools as we would like to, of course. Now, in the past, with the partnerships that we've had with schools, very receptive, also very interested in online safety programming. Of course, like I had mentioned, a lot of research is showing that teachers aren't feeling as comfortable talking about online safety in the classroom. So whenever they can have individuals, of course, our team is a team of young individuals. So being able to come in and connect with the youth to talk about online safety is something that a lot of schools have expressed a lot of interest in, and they are fans of. Yes.
Okay. And my final question is for Mr. Aborn and any of the other panelists that may want to chime in. And I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, but What recommendations do you have for the department in terms of how it is implementing the grant programs? And what recommendations do you have for this committee as we think about how to prioritize funding for the coming fiscal year?
Well, I think that is probably the critical question for this hearing, and certainly is a complicated one because there's so many factors at play here. Obviously, scalability is something you're going to hear over and over and over again. There are lots of good programs out in the country, but they struggle, frankly, to maintain their day-to-day existence and to expand to meet the need. In our own particular case, as soon as we get our evaluations in, I know there's interest in just in the Department of Justice and in districts across the country, prosecution districts, to do this work there as well. We have to be very mindful of the fact that we know from the traditional crime space that recidivism is a big issue. The last thing in the world we want is recidivism in the terrorist space. So we need to confront that head on. So we need to be thinking about evaluations as the department is doing, target populations, and also building interlocking circles of support out there so that the members of our society know they have resources to go to when they confront a particular problem. We want to reach out to families and loved ones of people who are known to be mobilizing, particularly when those family members will not necessarily pick up the phone and call the FBI or call the NYPD or any other local law enforcement agency. We need to make sure they have access to the kinds of services that can help stop that mobilization process. And that's the key. And that's why I say we want to focus on precision prevention. We want to understand who those individuals are who are beginning to mobilize towards violence and break that cycle. That to us is the challenge.
Okay. I have just been told that our WebEx time has run out, so I apologize to the other two panelists. If you have some suggestions, please submit them to the subcommittee. And with that, I want to thank the witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing about further progress on your TVTP programs, and the best of luck to all of you for the work that you're doing. The Subcommittee on Homeland Security stands adjourned.